This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is an anthropologist and a human rights activist. He's the director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. He is also the author of several books, most recently War Against the People, Israel, the Palestinians and Global Pacification, published in English by Pluto Press. It analyzes the so-called securocratic paradigm that dominates global politics and the pivotal role that Israel plays in its midst. Professor Jeff Halper, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and thanks for having me on.
So let's start with the title, Global Pacification. Please explain. I don't think you mean by it what most people may think you mean by it.
I'm not sure what people think I mean by it. Pacification, it's not a word that's used very commonly, and that's part of the idea is to reappropriate that term. Really means suppressing a population to a point where it simply can't resist anymore. It was the term that the Spanish and the Portuguese used for the conquest of Latin and South America. Mm-hmm. It has a much more specific meaning in terms of the Native Americans in the U.S. and in Vietnam and in Algeria and so on. But in a sense, I put my analysis within the context of global capitalism, in which I say, really, capitalism, it presents a nice face, capitalism. That's the idea. It's this friendly, consumer-based system, Ronald McDonald and Hollywood and MTV and so on. But when, in fact, people begin to resist exploitation or the violence that's inherent to the capitalist system, the inequalities and so on, it has an iron fist within its velvet Ronald McDonald glove. And it's able to enforce its hegemony in very brutal ways. I mean, we can see that in different parts of the world. And so, in fact, what I'm saying is the capitalist system is intending to pacify us. Mm-hmm. If we go along with the game, we're the middle classes and we like to be consumers, and maybe we're part of the 1%, which is actually much less than 1%, and our lives are pretty good, then it doesn't have to pass. We're self-pacified in a sense. But if, in fact, like most humanity, we're excluded from the system and exploited and oppressed and so on, and we begin to resist, then we have to be pacified by force. And that's, in a sense, what I mean by the global, because we live in a world system that's a world capitalist system.
Do people still attempt to resist this system? I mean, ever since the decline of communism, there hasn't really been a counterforce to be reckoned with.
Well, I mean, you do have ISIS and you have Islamic.
But they benefit from capitalism just like us.
That's a part of the resistance. You have. Black Lives Matter in the U.S. In other words, the resistance isn't necessarily organized. But, capitalists have an actual concept that's called surplus humanity, in which they have basically excluded 2/3 of humanity from the capitalist system. These are people that will never be consumers, which is the greatest sin of all. They'll never be educated. They'll never be productive in the capitalist sense. They'll be warehoused. Basically, they'll simply be imprisoned. The problem is that those people, the poorest people, are sitting atop very valuable resources that the capitalist system needs. And so the idea is, how do we extract their resources while at the same time excluding them from the system?
You're talking about people in the Far East and in Africa and places like that?
You have Africa and you have what's called the Third World, the Global South. But more and more, of course, the Global South is moving north. So you have the Occupy Wall Street movement. You have Occupy movements all over the world, including here in Tel Aviv, Yanni. And, you have...
But aren't they part of the self-pacifying population?
No, I mean, those, you see, no. But
I mean, they have the privilege to protest.
That's right. Except the middle class itself is becoming more and more excluded.
Right.
Especially young people. A lot of people accuse the young generation of not being political, of simply being consumers and so on. And I cut them a lot of slack because I think, in my day when I was young, I'm almost 70 now, back in the 50s and 60s, they were labor unions, trade unions. You had some job security. You could think about a job that you have for your whole life. Mm-hmm. Today, everything is temp, and the young people have no security whatsoever. So even if they manage to get together some kind of a okay-paying McDonald's temp-type job, they really don't have the security. And so what you're beginning to see in Europe, look at the indignados. Look at Podemos in Spain that might even take over the government. In other words, you have more and more the feeling that the experience of the global south is beginning to move north. Right. And, and you always have, of course, the racism and so on that's involved. And so you have as much resistance in the global north as in the south.
Okay, I want to understand now how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict feeds into all this, because it is, at the end of the day, a national conflict over territory, narratives. Capitalism, it seems, is marginal to it.
Well, it seems, except that, Zionism has always been a colonial movement. And it started in a way in the end of the 19th century when colonialism was still sort of
colonial
okay.
In what sense?
Colonial in the sense of Europeans coming in and taking countries from indigenous populations.
Right, okay.
I mean, the Zionists don't see it that way. But certainly for the Palestinian point of view, this was a settler colonial enterprise. Mm-hmm. And the Zionists are very upfront about it until today. This is our country. It's the land of Israel, belongs to us. And there are no Palestinians. We call them Arabs.
Right.
And they have no national rights. So even 100 years ago, it wasn't an easy sell to come into somebody else's country and say, this is really ours, and take it away. So it turns out, as I've been reading the history of Zionism, that one of the principal tenets of the Zionist movement since the very beginning was what was called serving the hegemons. Mm-hmm. You linked the Zionist enterprise to the big powers that could protect you and could advance you and give you that space to continue your colonization. It began with Herzl, with the Ottoman Sultan trying to get a charter over Palestine. Mm-hmm. He went to the German Kaiser. After World War I, it was the British, the Balfour Declaration and so on. Mm-hmm. After 1948, it was the French. And a lot of them, until today, the basis of the Israeli military industry and the nuclear is French, until 67. And then after 67, it became the United States. Mm-hmm. Now, what's interesting is the story doesn't necessarily stop there because, as much as we love America and all that stuff, Israel is the number 2 or 3 or 4 arms supplier to China. You have the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, that are a counter-hegemonic bloc that are challenging European-American hegemony. And Israel is super strong in every one of the BRICS countries, militarily speaking. Here, Erdogan in Turkey just said the other day that Turkey needs Israel. Yep. So, in a sense, the idea then of serving, it's a quid pro quo. We serve the hegemons, whether it's the big powers or middle-level powers or local dictators and warlords in Equatorial Guinea and so on. We serve them, and the quid pro quo is that then they support. They don't have to support it outright, but de facto they support Israel's occupation and our keeping of the, and the whole Zionist enterprise that's leading towards complete apartheid today.
Mm-hmm. So the picture that you're painting here is, on the one hand, pretty bleak, but also something that, we kind of think that we knew before, that global politics is run by interests rather than values and morals.
But the question is, what can a little tiny country like Israel give the hegemons of the world? I mean, what is Israel going to give the United States or Europe? I mean, how do you explain the Israeli training of the LAPD in Los Angeles? This is the most brutal SWAT team force in the United States. What do they need, Israeli? How do you explain, the Israel being the number 2 or 3 arms supplier to India or China? What we're doing all over the world. So that the Israeli Defense Ministry, which is connected, of course, to the whole government, has a concept that they call niche filling. And the idea is that we're a small country, but we're very high-techy because of our military background. And so we can identify in a very strategic way the niches that the powers that be, again, from the big powers down to local warlords, what do they need in order to stay in power, in order to keep their control? In terms of military, but also in terms of security. I mean,
what's the difference exactly?
Well, for example, after the attacks in Paris, the whole French government and stores and corporations are running to Israel to get all the security devices and the training to lock down Paris. Now with all the refugees coming through Europe, it's a gold mine for Israel. They're really replicating the Israeli smart fences, sensors and all kinds of fencing in southeastern Europe in order to block the refugees from coming.
But security is a major concern, isn't it? It shouldn't be downplayed.
No.
And Israel, well, I mean, you should give it credit for, making headway in research, and they're just playing the game.
Well, somebody said once that if you didn't know where I was coming from, which is from the left, and I'm critical, I would sound like the Israeli Chamber of Commerce. Yeah. Whoa, this is great. Where do I sign? How do I buy this stuff? It's true. But what I'm trying to say is that Israel is exporting the occupation. Its knowledge in the military, security, and policing functions. I put all those three things together. After 9/11, there's really no difference from the military. It's all graded military, security, policing. So all the tactics, the weapon systems, the surveillance systems, the security systems, the models of control, what I call the matrix of control that Israel developed, over the course of 50 years in the West Bank of occupation, is all exportable. And part of Israel's what I call security politics. Security politics is how does a country parlay its prowess in military security affairs into political clout? So Israel's ability to generalize from the Palestinians, to say what you're experiencing in Paris is what our part of our experience, and we're the experts. What you're experiencing in Ferguson, in the U.S. with the black population, what you're experiencing everywhere with the Tibetans, wherever it is in the world, we're your answer. Because we've experienced all of that with the Palestinians, and we've developed the kinds of technologies and tactics that will be effective.
But the control over the Palestinians in the West Bank is generally low tech. I mean, it's military jeeps patrolling on roads in the West Bank. It's checkpoints. I mean, there's a heavy military presence of soldiers in the West Bank, the way it was done, I don't know, since time immemorial. What is it exactly about the technology that seeps inspiration or whatever it is from the actual occupation?
Well, the illusion is that it looks low tech. The degree that you have very sophisticated technologies of control in the background allows you to lower your explicit outward military profile. The idea of gated communities all over the world is that the people in the gated communities don't feel that they're gated. I mean, they want the feeling, like Israelis don't want the feeling that they're being walled in. So the wall is built in a way that Israelis never see it.
Yeah,
I mean, in certainly in Tel Aviv, but in Jerusalem too, you don't have an idea that you're somehow surrounded by a wall. You're living a normal life. So what you do is you embed the technologies to a degree that they become invisible. So, for example, Israel is one of the world's leaders in surveillance systems. Very Orwellian, totalizing systems of not only tracking behavior of everyone in the city, but predicting what they're going to do and where they're going to go. I mean, well, all this super technology, which is digitalized and, state of the art. I mean, Israel's taken over airports almost all over the world. And urban security systems comes from the checkpoints. You got millions of people passing there. It's like the occupied territory is a laboratory. I mean, the point isn't so much control. Israel can easily control the Palestinians. That's not the problem. The idea is, though, how do we use that population in their everyday movements, back and forth, and then nighttime raids? If you listen to Breaking the Silence, what they're telling us all the time is most of the raids we do have absolutely no security purpose. They're simply to be a presence or to train troops. So in other words, if we have to look at the control that Israel has in the occupied territory more as a laboratory type thing rather than a heavy-handed overt kind of military control.
So if I understand you correctly, Israel really has no interest in ending the occupation.
That's
because
right.
it gives them so much political influence and
economic.
Exactly, and profit as well.
That's
so
right.
how do you explain the word, however, limited, it's debatable.
You're explaining it. Why was it limited? Why didn't Netanyahu say 2 weeks ago we're going to live under the sword forever?
No, but Netanyahu perhaps is one example, but you can look at Rabin and Barak and Olmert, who have invested their political capital in trying to end the occupation.
Right. And no, they didn't, though. I mean, I had two questions writing this book, War Against the People. One was, how does Israel get away with it? That was one question that we sort of touched on a bit. Yep. The other question is, why didn't Israel grab the two-state solution 30 years ago? When the Palestinians offered it. 30 years, in 1988, the PLO said to Israel, take 78% of the country. Israel, we recognize it. Give us a little state in the occupied territory, and you get peace, security, and 78% of the country. Now, not in 88, because that was Shamir. 92, you get Rabin. And not only Rabin, but remember, this was a labor merits government.
Yep.
There was no Likud, there were no settlers, there was no right wing, there was no religious. It was completely labor and merits. And they built more settlements at a faster rate during that period than Netanyahu does. There was, if you look on the ground, there was absolutely no hint of any readiness for an actual two-state solution at a time when labor and merits were in power. I think the explanation for why didn't they grab the two-state solution is that Israel, in fact, you have to look at the occupation as a resource. And not only an economic resource. Of course, a lot of the Israeli economy, probably most of the Israeli economy is around that laboratory because it feeds into high tech and so on. But beyond that, again, it's the idea of political clout. That what gets you at the table with the big boys is your prowess in the military and security realms. And that's what without the occupation, let me put it this way, without the occupation, what would Israel be? New Zealand. It'd be some little country that'd be nice to visit. It certainly wouldn't be the fourth largest nuclear power in the world.
So what can be done? I mean, it really all the signs are pointing in one direction, and that is that the occupation and the conflict and the arms industry and all those bad things that we were just talking about are going to persist.
Well, I mean, I'm not quite that fatalistic. I mean, I've been an activist my whole life. And I believe that if we organize and if we tell people what's going on, and with all the dissatisfaction, that in fact you can mobilize people to change things. So I have two agendas. One is to end the occupation, but that I'm doing in another hat with another book. I wrote a book before this called An Israeli in Palestine about that. What this book tries to do, War Against the People, is to what I call globalize Palestine. And to say that Israel-Palestine is a microcosm of what's happening in the bigger world, where the capitalist system and the different elites are trying to pacify all of us. So as I say this to audiences abroad, as your police forces and security forces and armies are becoming Israelized, you're becoming Palestinianized. We have a saying, a slogan in the Israeli peace movement that we're all Palestinians. And we mean that in the sense of solidarity, of course. Yeah. But literally, you could say, we're all becoming Palestinians from the point of view that we're all on the receiving end of the Israeli security and military apparatus that's developed on the Palestinians. But do you think
that people could resist? Because governments, at the end of the day, driven by those interests, are much, much stronger.
That's right. And that's where I think Israel's misreading the map. Because you see, Israel measures how well it's doing by governments. And it's true, and that's why I say, how does Israel get away with it? Gets away with it because it serves those governments in an effective way. That's a quid pro quo. But that doesn't work with the people. And if you go out, and that's what BDS is really showing us, if you go out to the people, there's been a tremendous ocean change in terms of public opinion. And that's trickling up. governments will be the last ones to fall into place, but they will fall into place. And I think Israel is missing that, and that's where I see actually my work as being effective, because I'm not going to have an impact on Congress, the American Congress, or maybe the British government and so on, but I will have an impact on the people. And over time, especially if we can link this Palestine issue with other issues, because, when the Ferguson thing broke out in the U.S. with the police brutality against the blacks, right away the connection was made to Gaza. And there's today very strong African-American Palestinian ties that see those common threads. And that's going to create this sea change from below that will eventually, and I don't think in the far future, change government policy.
Mm-hmm. Well, on this optimistic note, I'm afraid we'll have to wrap up. But Jeff Halper, thank you very much for coming in today and talking to us. Your recent book, War Against the People, Israel, the Palestinians, and Global Pacification. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me on.
That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.
And baby, don't play around. Tell me what's on your mind. Take a moment to clear your head. No wrong's or right. You know I can take it all. You know I keep standing tall. Whatever you say is good, just keep it real and true.